Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guests have done something not only remarkable, but jaw-droppingly unique. In 1974, when our guests were teenagers in Minnesota, they saw the MGM movie That's Entertainment and fell in love with classic Hollywood movies. In the summer of 1978, fresh out of high school, these two starstruck kids traveled to Los Angeles and were somehow able to convince Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly to meet with them for an interview. That experience opened the door to dozens more interviews with the greatest Hollywood legends of all time, including Lucille Ball, Milton Berle, Bob Hope, George Burns, Jimmy Cagney, Charlton Heston, Vincente Minnelli, Gregory Peck, and many more. Those interviews are compiled in a book entitled Hollywood Heyday, 75 Candid Interviews with Golden Age Legends. These interviews are nothing like anything you've ever seen. Somehow, these unassuming young men were able to get the most iconic superstars to open up in a way that no one else has ever been able to do. And that's what makes their book so special. It's my great pleasure to welcome authors David Fantle and Tom Johnson to our show. David and Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Harvey. Thank you.
David and Tom, we are roughly the same age. And like you, I was one of those teenagers who was completely obsessed with the golden age of Hollywood after seeing That's Entertainment. But most teenagers from our generation were not interested in classic Hollywood films. What was it about the golden age movies that resonated with you?
First thing, when we saw things like Fred Astaire dancing on the walls or the ceiling, or Judy Garland doing Get Happy from Summer Stock, or of course the iconic Gene Kelly Singing in the Rain, Tom and I just innately said, wow, there's something artistic about this, the likes of which we've never seen before. And being 15 years old at that time, 1974, and both seeing the movie in a theater in downtown St. Paul, Minnesota, we sort of got hooked, and we said, we don't just want to see these clips, we want to see these films in their entirety. And so started our journey.
And the journey started, sort of how Dave explained it. But in order to see these musicals, which weren't on TV that often, maybe once a year on one of the local channels, we had to start a film society where we rented 16 millimeter films from an outfit in Illinois, so that we could sort of satiate our own love and our own interest in these musicals. And we'd show them at nursing homes, and we split the cost among all these different nursing homes to sort of pay for, I think it was about $200 or $150 for renting these movies.
Yeah, it always depended on the quality of the films. A Singing in the Rain might have been $200. A Words and Music or a Dewberry Was a Lady might have been $75. And Tom and I not only satiated ourselves by seeing these films in their entirety, as we all know, not every film from the golden era is golden. In the case of these musicals, some of them weren't great, but they usually had an unbelievable, memorable number or two. And so the good side is Tom and I got to see these films in their entirety, but in some cases, they weren't the best films, and we had to see them 4, 5, 6 times.
Now, when I was a kid, I wrote to all the stars and I got autographed pictures. I got hundreds of them. But how did you go a million steps further and persuade them to actually meet with you in person?
It really, the golden Willy Wonka golden ticket for us was when we first met Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly in the summer of 1978, after we had graduated from Highland Park High School in St. Paul. We had done about a 2-year correspondence with both of their personal secretaries. And they had, said very often that we can't meet you. Our schedules are packed. We just can't get around to seeing you. But we were very persistent. And they finally green lighted within a week of each other, which we always thought they talked to each other and said, we got to get these little kids off our back. And Fred, if you see them, I'll see them. Gene, if you see them, I'll see them. And that was it. We went out to LA and saw these guys, and we got little Polaroid snapshots of Fred Astaire. And that's really what opened the door to seeing all these other stars, because it validated us. It legitimized us to all these other stars that maybe wouldn't have seen us. Like James Cagney, for one, said, well, if Freddie saw you, I'll see you. So Astaire was absolutely universally revered in Hollywood, and he, along with Gene Kelly, but really that photo of Fred Astaire that we put in every one of our self-addressed stamped envelopes to see them, that was what did it, I think.
Well, yeah, and Tom's exactly right. The other add-on to that is we were able to get some newspaper clippings for our Films on Wheels venture. And so we would include those with the letter, the self-addressed stamped envelope. We mail it to their homes. It's amazing for people who know how the world operates today, particularly with the internet and a gauntlet of publicists and handlers, to realize that you could actually write a letter to a star, 40 some years ago, and they would actually respond, which was the case. But Tom's exactly right. Astaire and Kelly were so revered, they opened the floodgates. It was almost like, if Gene and Fred will see these two guys, I guess we will too. And again, that Films on Wheels and the clip, I think, also sealed the deal. The other thing is when we started shortly after as college journalists at the University of Minnesota, at the Minnesota Daily, we had a newspaper outlet introducing these golden age stars to a younger, newer audience. And so we had youth on our side, and I think that counted for something as well.
Yeah, one thing too, Harvey, I can add on to this, and I think I mentioned it before, and Dave did, but the self-addressed stamped envelope, which is so innocuous, you would think, why would you send that? These stars, they can send you a response, they can afford postage. A lot of these older stars, they appreciated that. It was like a sign of respect, kind of, that we had sent. We didn't assume that they just, find a stamp and send us back a response. So a lot of them mentioned that. They said, it was very kind of you, very thoughtful to send a self-addressed stamped envelope back for a response. And sometimes they sent back the response, which was, well, I can't see you, but thanks for, getting me off the hook on the postage. So.
Well, you see, little things matter. When I start my day, I love a great cup of coffee to get me going. And as I'm sure you know, I love the golden age of Hollywood and the legendary stars of that era. Earlier this year, I discovered a terrific new company, Breakfast at Dominique's, that's created a series of coffee blends to honor the legacies of many legendary stars. One of my favorites is the Joan Crawford Grand Hotel blend, rich and bold with hints of nuts, cocoa, and soft spices. And there's a brand new Joan Crawford coffee called the Unchained blend, a hazelnut medium roast. There's the Boris Karloff Master of Horror blend, which is an African dark roast. And the Mary Pickford, the Sweetheart blend, a French vanilla medium roast. The Harold Lloyd, the Boy's Best Friend blend, is a Peruvian light roast. The Ava Gardner, the Goddess blend, is a Sumatra Colombian dark roast. There's the Ella Fitzgerald, the Jazz Club blend, a candied pecan flavored medium roast. And just making its debut on the roster of these great coffees is the Bozo the Clown, the Big Top blend, a caramel corn flavored medium roast launched by the wonderful David Arquette. And I'm absolutely thrilled to tell you that very soon, Breakfast at Dominique's will be introducing the Harvey Brownstone Talk Show Blend. It's my very own medium roast coffee, and I know you're just going to love it. Breakfast at Dominique's uses only high-quality vegan, sugar-free, and gluten-free ground coffee that's organic and follows fair trade practices, and that's important to me. Not only is the coffee delicious, it's beautifully packaged and makes a great gift for friends, especially people like me who are classic movie buffs. If you're looking for a great cup of coffee, give Breakfast at Dominique's a try. You can order any of the coffees named after some of the greatest cinematic legends, and me, at hollywoodblends.com. To tell you the truth, I even feel glamorous when I'm drinking it. Why not have a cup while you're watching our show and add a touch of Hollywood to your day? Now, as I mentioned in my introduction, and as Robert Wagner mentions in his foreword to your book, you were somehow able to get these big stars to open up in a very candid way. How did you do that?
Well, I think we were, again, going back to, we had youth on our side, and we were introducing these stars to a newer audience. And we didn't go in there like we were gotcha kind of journalists. We went in there because we respected the people we were meeting. But yeah, in the course of that, we understood that, yeah, people like to know a little bit more about their personal lives and things like that. So we would diplomatically probe those things, and it usually got us some frank responses, particularly with people like Bob Hope, who wasn't known to be particularly candid. But it also had some moments when we were confronted with someone as blunt and direct as Lucille Ball.
Oh, we're going to get to her.
Uh-oh.
Now, there's a theme that runs through many of your interviews, and it's the fact that most of the big stars you met with were incredibly humble about all of their accomplishments, especially Fred Astaire. Did that surprise you?
You know, actually, it sort of didn't. A lot of these stars that we met, in fact, almost every one of them, had been in the spotlight for a half a century or longer. And they knew how to, they were comfortable with their celebrity, and they were different than a lot of stars that you would see now, or even in the last 10 or 15 years, many of whom we've interviewed. We've interviewed a lot of other younger stars, but the old ones just had a comfortability factor. They had, back in the studio system days of the 30s and 40s, from which many of these stars had sprung, they were taught that, part of their job was to avail themselves to the press and to field questions and, not to be jerks. And they were all, 99.9% of them actually took that to heart. And they were just wonderful. They, we saw them all of them were first person. They were all, we saw them all in their homes or at restaurants. So they took the time and the effort to meet with us, and they were going to be okay, I think. They wouldn't have done that if they weren't prepared to, really sit down and spend some time with us. So, and we really appreciated that. That was wonderful.
And I think also a little bit testimony, not to, toot our own horns, but in many cases, these weren't one and done meetings or interviews. I mean, in the case of Gene Kelly, we went back to his home only about 2 years before he passed away. So there was about a 15-year gap in that. We saw Artie Shaw a few times. We reconnected with George Burns several times. We have Christmas cards every year from George Burns and Gene Kelly. The director, George Sidney, who did a lot of the wonderful MGM musicals. We had a correspondence, dozens of correspondence of him throughout the years. So it wasn't just one and done. We had some ongoing relationships with these people as well.
But the fact that they were even willing to meet with you more than once speaks volumes about the sincerity that they must have detected from you.
Yeah, that's very kind of you to say, Harvey. Thank you. And yeah, that's true. We were really, and Dave kind of touched on this, we were big fans. I mean, we interviewed basically everyone we sought out. We wanted to talk to. We wanted to spend time interviewing with them. It was not a chore for us, even when we were doing it, for the St. Paul Dispatch newspaper or the Minnesota Daily. We loved doing these interviews. It was a thrill to meet these people. Sid Charisse, Lucy, Harry Warren, the great songwriter, Hollywood songwriter. I mean, we were just tickled, to be able to spend time with all these people. Hoagie Carmichael, we had some drinks with him. He beat us out in that respect. But
say for real film buffs, when you see a name, as Tom mentioned, like Harry Warren, that doesn't really resonate with most people. But then you realize all the great song hits, and you go, "Oh, I know his music." Or Chuck Walters, the director, you don't know the name, but you know High Society, and you know Summer Stock and Good News and Easter Parade. Or George Sidney, Showboat, or Annie Get Your Gun, or Anchors Away. So we're introducing people to names they may not know, but they certainly know their work.
I want to ask you now about some of the people you interviewed, starting with one of your very first, Gene Kelly. You interviewed him twice, in 1978 and 1994. What were your impressions of him?
We interviewed him at his house at 725 North Rodeo, and that's where he lived right after getting out of the Navy in World War II. He lived there until he passed away, and it was great. We were in suits, which was another big thing, showing respect to these people, that we interviewed. They were old school people, and we were always in suits and ties, and they kind of appreciated that, especially the ladies did. And we came into Gene's house, and it was just this beautiful home. And we sat in his living room, and we talked with him. He had come in from his library, which he said he spent all his time in studying economics. He loved to study economics. He had been, I think, an economics major in Pennsylvania, at the University of Pennsylvania, I think, where he went. And he was great. He really kind of reminded me, and I think Dave will agree to this, as sort of a teacher, because he had taught dance to kids back in the 30s, before he went to Broadway. So he had this in sort of instructive kind of, attitude. And I remember, I think I mispronounced the Cannes Film Festival. I don't know what I said. And he kind of corrected me. And he was a Francophile anyway. He's very fluent in French. So, which was very different from Fred, who was just, like you said, Harvey, very kind of shy and retiring. But Gene was more of a teacher, but a wonderful, wonderful guy.
Yeah, and when the many years passed between those two meetings, and when we first saw him, he was about 66 years old. He was still the Gene Kelly that we know, still played tennis, actually played tennis at Harry Warren's tennis court. But when we saw him in the 90s, this was just before he started having a series of strokes, which was his demise. But, what was shocking to us, and what would have been shocking to everyone who knows him from the image of films like Singing in the Rain and all of that, is that he did not have his hairpiece on. He literally had to hold my arm just to stand up on the chair. And so, this was a stark contrast to the Gene Kelly of 1978. But again, he welcomed us, and we were, 40 years old. But the first thing he said was, the college boys are back. So, it was like 14 years or whatever, 18 years did not pass. It was like just yesterday.
Yeah.
I love the way Gene Kelly talked about working with Judy Garland. He really praised her work ethic and her ability to pick up dance steps so quickly.
Yeah, he did, Harvey. We mentioned Summer Stock, which was always a favorite film of Dave and mine. And we mentioned what it was like working with her. And he said that she was the quickest study he ever worked with. She wasn't really a trained dancer, but she was just this, she could pick anything up like a sponge. And within maybe a half hour, she would have a dance or a difficult step or a combination down. And as far as singing went, Gene couldn't say enough about Judy. He said the greatest singer he had ever known, the greatest natural talent he had ever seen for his money. She was just absolutely unbeatable.
Yeah, if you look at the recording work, to tag off of what Tom was saying about her vocals, music arrangers, composers who work with her, like Saul Chaplin, were constantly amazed on how she could come into her recording sessions. And, she wouldn't always nail it on the first time, but man, she didn't need a lot of takes before she nailed these songs.
That's for sure. Another star you interviewed who worked so much with Judy Garland was Mickey Rooney. You described him as an inexhaustible live action cartoon. Why?
Well, we had done this interview out in the western part of the San Fernando Valley where he lived at this Hyatt hotel, as I recall, just off the 101 freeway. And he came in, he was late for the interview, and we had the interview in this like reception area of the hotel, which was sort of open to the public. And he just trundled in like a miniature Sherman tank, and he had said his excuse for being late was that his car had run out of gas on the freeway, which, who knows? But, he came in and he just plopped himself on the couch. And basically it was just this recitation of the life of Mickey Rooney. I think we got in maybe 2 or 3 questions, but he just went off on his own tangent, and we just sort of let him talk because he was very, very entertaining and loved Judy, obviously, and kind of got a little misty-eyed when we brought that up. He just sort of had this little reverie for a second and just thought she was, again, fantastic, just amazing.
And we were fortunate to get to Mickey. And yeah, Tom was right. He was sort of known for embellishing, and he's probably not the only one in Hollywood who would embellish stories. But there was a woman, a fan came up to him while we were there and, said, Mr. Rooney, I really have enjoyed your work. Could I have an autograph? And he sort of shooed her away, like, can't you see I'm doing an interview? And we were sort of taken aback by that kind of response. But again, he was very, I would say, bombastic and unpredictable. And Tom and I had a sort of a late interview with him when you look at the 1990s, because then some years later, from what we understood, he was actually, his handlers, his family, whoever, was actually charging people to sit down with him and have interviews. And of course, that's something Tom and I, steadfastly refused to do at any time. And it didn't come up much. On a rare occasion, a star, and not a huge star, would say, you know, are you going to pay me for sitting down with me? But we never did that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that because I won't do that either.
No. Good.
Now, turning to everybody's all-time favorite, Lucille Ball, you interviewed her in 1980, and you described her as a tough as nails businesswoman with no sense of humor. That must have been a little disappointing.
Well, yeah, it was actually kind of shocking because we interviewed her in her house on Roxbury Drive, which was where all Ira Gershwin, George Gershwin had lived there, and Oscar Levant. It was sort of this, you know, a major thoroughfare of stars. I think Jimmy Stewart lived next door. Yes. And we went in, and she was sitting there in a little kerchief inside her house with a little kerchief and her Kit Kat glasses. They were sunglasses. She was in orange hair, just shockingly, pulsatingly orange, her hair, and smoking a cigarette. And we began to ask her sort of what we thought were kind of fun questions about her youth when she had run away from home when she was a little kid. She wanted to be a big Broadway star, which we had gotten from Current Biography, which, you know, it wasn't a tell-all scandal sheet. They were published every year in libraries. And we asked her, and then she immediately was sort of offended and you know, said, if I would have known you were going to ask me personal probing questions like that, I never would have let you in my house. And we were kind of like, whoa, you know, Jesus, Lucy. I mean, so we had to kind of redirect a little bit, but then she sort of calmed down, took a few puffs of her cigarette, and then everything was fine. And Dave can elaborate on this when he takes over on this question, but she was just very, very, like you say, Harvey, you know, very direct, very no nonsense, very interesting, but not like the wacky Lucy that we know and love from all the TV shows.
Well, and you know, it came to mind because what just broke last month was that Being the Ricardos, the show with Nicole Kidman and Javier Bardem as Desi. And if the screenwriter, Mr. Sorkin, would have looked at our interview, it may have modified his screenplay a bit, because a couple of things that Lucy said, and we asked her, was any of I Love Lucy ad-libbed? And she said, I hope you have your tape recorder on, because absolutely nothing was ad-libbed. The writers knew our characters, knew us inside and out. We came, we did our job, and we read the lines that were on the paper, which of course is a little contrary to what you saw on that depiction, on that movie. The other thing is, of course, they focused on the Stomping Grapes episode, and you know, there's the famous with the candy, the factory with the candy. And she said that, you know, people peg me as being this, you know, physical slapstick comedian. But if you look at the hundreds of episodes of I Love Lucy and then the later incarnations of the show, she said very few episodes did we do blatant physical comedy or slapstick. And when we did, it flowed naturally out of the script narrative. And again, so those two things were a little in contradiction to what I saw depicted in that recent movie.
And I would say, Harvey, just an add-on here, which I thought was kind of interesting, more interesting even than her being kind of brusque or very businesslike, was who she thought the funniest person she had ever known, had ever met on stage or off, and that was Dean Martin. She said he was an absolute hysterical crack-up, which I thought that's kind of great, you know? I mean, maybe Jerry Lewis would beg to differ, but that was very, very interesting and neat to know.
It was. Now, I wasn't surprised to read in your book that Lucy was all business because everyone described her that way. But I was disappointed that she was so cold with you because Lucy was very fond of her young male fans. In fact, two of them, Lee Tannen and Gary Stern, wrote books about their friendships with Lucy when they were young men. And Lee Tannen appeared on our show. So it's too bad that she didn't warm up to you like she did with all those other young guys.
Well, I would say, as Tom said, you know, when we recalibrated where we were going and saw that we were maybe getting into a little area we didn't want to get, we recalibrated. And then I think it went very well. And I mean, what I think has to be said, and people who know Lucy know this, is she broke the glass ceiling. She was the first major woman mogul in the television industry, in a male-dominated industry. So the fact that she was tough as nails is certainly acceptable and understandable. And when you look at Desi and her, they brought the Untouchables to the screen, and Mannix and Star Trek and other things. They were juggling a lot of plates in the air and beyond just performing on that television sitcom.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Now, in 1994, you interviewed Debbie Reynolds at a pivotal time in her life. She had just opened her own hotel and museum in Las Vegas, and you got to see her perform there as well at the hotel. Can you tell us a bit about her?
Yeah, Harvey, that was a very kind of an interesting interview and pre-interview, because we saw her in her, I think it was the Paddle Wheel Hotel. It was the old Paddle Wheel Hotel that she was in, and she had a showroom, and she and Rick Taylor were doing a show together, and we were by probably 30 years the youngest people in that audience, in like the front row. And she kept kind of looking at us, and then she started to say, like, make jokes, thinking that we were planted there by her daughter Carrie, as like a practical joke, because we were like, way younger than most of her audience. And then after we met her, and she gave us a tour of a lot of these, things that she had, a lot of the,
Memorabilia.
Memorabilia, yeah. Then she sort of warmed up. I mean, she was, funny. She said, and she told us, I thought you guys were planted here, but I thought it was a practical joke that my daughter was playing on me. But the memorabilia was amazing. We just saw a very, very little small slice of it. But I think we saw Dave, you'll remember the 7-Year Itch Marilyn Monroe costume. And I mean, it was just incredible. And she was great. I mean, she was just wonderful. And one thing she did, which was amazing, was that after the show, she went back, she went up to the front of the house and talked to everyone who stayed and autographed anything they gave. She didn't leave anyone wanting anything. She waited until they had all left, and there were maybe 50 people. And we asked her about that, and she said, I would have been nowhere without these people. These people gave me my career. They gave me this hotel, and I will never disrespect my fans ever. And we thought that was really something.
And you can see in Tom's background, mine is upstairs, the little memento of the Singing in the Rain poster that we're fortunate to have Debbie, Donald, Gene, and Sid Charisse sign for us. So that's just a memento. But just to add on briefly to Debbie, I always, when I talk about Debbie, I do say that probably her greatest legacy is her love of the golden age of Hollywood herself. She was a fan. She went and basically emptied her checking account at the famous MGM auctions to buy as much memorabilia as she could. And for decades, she was looking to find a home for this priceless memorabilia. And unfortunately, now the Academy Museum has opened. But the unfortunate thing is none of her precious memorabilia is in it, because toward the end of her life, she had a couple of very well-publicized auctions of this memorabilia that netted tens of millions of dollars. And now this precious memorabilia is in closets, in homes, who knows where, all over the world. And that's an unfortunate reality.
Yes, I asked Donnell Dadigan about that. She owns the Hollywood Museum. And I was very disappointed to learn that despite Donnell's gallant efforts to get some of that memorabilia for the Hollywood Museum, it was all auctioned off. It's really a shame.
Yeah. We had talked to her a little bit about that too. And she said it wasn't for want of trying. She was trying to donate anybody that would take it. I mean, a legitimate venue that would take it, but there were no offers. There was no one coming up with any kind of an offer, and it wasn't really money that she was after. She just wanted a good home. But like Dave said, this predated the whole Hollywood, the Academy Museum down on Wilshire. So, it was just bad timing, because now that memorabilia, oh my God, it would be snapped up in a second by the museum. But
now, one of the stars you interviewed, Robert Wagner, is very hard to get. I can tell you that from personal experience. He rarely ever gives interviews, but he sat down with you and talked for 3 hours about everybody from Mickey Rooney to Barbara Stanwyck to Jimmy Cagney and so many others. How in the world did you manage to get him in such a talkative mood?
Well, that's kind of an interesting thing. And again, it goes back to Fred Astaire and the snapshot that we would send people. Because RJ, as he likes to be called, if you've met him and talked to him for more than 30 seconds, he loved Fred Astaire. Fred Astaire was a guest star on his It Takes a Thief show in the 70s. He was he and Jill St. John were personal friends with both Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire and James Cagney. He told me all about, or both of us, I'm sorry, all about when he first came to Hollywood in the late 30s, that, he was at a private school and he became friends with all these young stars, these young kids of all these famous celebrities. And that's how he became to know them. And basically we just had a back and forth about olden Hollywood, old school Hollywood. And that's what he loved. He was kind of amazed, not to toot our own horn, that we had seen all these people that he kind of grew up with and knew. And so, Dave and I remember the flack, the press person coming in while trying to end the interview. And he'd just say, "We're not done yet. Get us coffee," And so that's it. He just kept extending it for, about 3 hours. And it was just a fantastic interview. He couldn't have been a nicer guy. And loves old Hollywood. I mean, he just lives it and he loves it. And he had great anecdotes that hopefully most of them are in that interview. It's in the book.
And he volunteered, Harvey, after we bonded, to write the foreword to our book. And, while the vast majority of people profiled in Hollywood Heyday started from our 1978 into the 1990s, people like RJ and Andre Previn and Leslie Caron, and Jack Carter, there's a handful of people that we probably all picked up within just the last 10 years. We were able to get them before, in some cases, they passed away. RJ and Leslie Caron are still a couple of the people in our book that are still with us.
And even Marie Saint, we can't forget her. So.
Yes, who's still with us.
Yes.
Wonderful person.
Yeah.
I think your most surprising interview for me was Artie Shaw. You described his interview as the phlegmatic ravings of an embittered misanthrope. Tell us about that experience.
Well, I'll just start and then Tom can jump in too, because Artie, had given up on Hollywood. And he wrote us a very interesting handwritten note consenting to see us, but saying, if you really want the standard Hollywood line and BS, don't count on it from me. He was very honest and frank. And he lived in Newbury Park outside of Los Angeles County. And we went to his home, and that was a case of two interviews about 15 years apart. But he was very blunt. He was very eccentric. And he was working on a semi-autobiographical book of his that I don't remember how many word count he was at the time, but to our knowledge, it would have been fascinating to see if it was ever published, but to our knowledge, it never has been. But he said, I'm sick of interviewers asking, what was behind Lana Turner's sweater and things like that. So he was humorous. He was a raconteur. He was married. We joke in our presentations and say 2 people in our book were married the equivalent of a total of 16 different times. And in fact, they actually shared a wife. And that, of course, was Mickey Rooney and Ava Gardner and Artie Shaw and Ava Gardner.
Yeah, although they didn't share the wives at the same time that we know of.
Not that we know. Yeah, right.
But the thing about Artie, too, was that he was a very intellectual guy. And he said that, during that first interview, I just want to clear the record. I have not made my clarinet into a lamp, and all of that. And he said that, basically his career as a clarinetist was how he was going to finance a writing career. He was not a frustrated writer, because he had some books that came out, but that's what he always wanted to be. And he saw, playing big band jazz and then later small group jazz as a way to finance his writing career. And that book that has never been published, he said the name of it was The Education of Albee Snow. And it was sort of an autobiographical thing, based a lot on his life. And he said that, unfortunately, probably a sequoia up north gave its life to just, basically keep him in paper for this. And he kept the loose leaf paper. He said, I wouldn't care if my whole house, my library, all my memorabilia burned down, as long as this book is saved. And he kept it in one of these little portable safes. And every chapter had its own little manila folder, and he showed us the safe, and he opened it up, and it was just gigantic amount of pages in each little chapter binder. And then he locked the safe again. It was a fireproof safe. So that was Artie.
It was the one thing that was humorous that stands out. I don't know how we got to talking about this, but he said something to the effect that if Lawrence Welk could hear what he was playing, he'd commit Harry Carey with his baton.
Well, he was a character, that's for sure. You interviewed George Burns when he was 82, and again when he was about to turn 99. He had a great attitude about getting older, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, George made an art form of growing old. You know, when Gracie died relatively young in the 60s, he sort of reinvented himself, not the least of which was, of course, winning an Academy Award for The Sunshine Boys. But unlike Lucy, George and people like Milton Berle were pretty much like gagsters. They were on, you know, they were jokesters. I remember we were there at one point we had the second largest aftershock of the Northridge earthquake. And Tom said to him, "Did you feel that earthquake last night?" And he said, "Feel it? That's the only form of aerobic exercise I get anymore." You know, so he was very quick up into his 90s. And yeah, I think we saw him at about 98, 97, 98 years old, still very sharp. He was scheduled to play the London Palladium and Caesar's Palace on his 100th. What happened not long after our visit is he had a fall in his bathtub at his Beverly Hills home, and it required brain surgery. So unfortunately, he never made a public appearance again. He was not able to perform, but he did live to be 100.
And one thing, we didn't get much. We got a few signed pictures of people. I think George Burns we got, and Fred Astaire, and people like that. But we didn't really collect a lot of memorabilia. But George gave us 2 cigars to remember him by, and he smoked a ton of them a day. And the ones he gave us were 95-cent El Producto cigars. That's what he smoked. George Burns, who could probably, you know, send a private plane to Havana and get anything he wanted. They were 95-cent El Productos.
I hope you kept those cigars.
Dave still has for his.
Yeah, they're in a glass case, and the company gave them to him free, which was in contrast. And he smoked anywhere from about 15 a day. He had a holder. He claimed he didn't inhale. Still lived to be 100. And whereas Milton Berle also was attached to his cigar, but unlike Burns, his were actually $15 Cuban cigars.
Yeah. Now, what about James Cagney? You interviewed him in 1979, and you said he was the antithesis of tough. What were your impressions of him?
He was great. We interviewed him up in his right off Coldwater Canyon. That's where he lived. He was wonderful. He was just coming out of retirement to be in that Ragtime, that movie that he was really one of the last things he ever did. It was a morning interview, and we came in, and he was in his bathrobe, and he had sort of bedhead hair that was sticking up. And he said, you know, to me, because, you know, I'm not that tall, but I guess taller than he was, he said, "You must be a 6-footer," you know, in that Cagney patois that he had. And he really, all he wanted to talk about mostly was his musicals and Yankee Doodle Dandy and hoofing back on Broadway in the 20s and 30s. He didn't care that much about the hoodlum movies, as he called them, the gangster movies. We talked about musicals with him and about Fred Astaire, who we called Freddie. That's what he called Fred Astaire. And he ended up inviting us to dinner after that interview with him, which was really wonderful.
Yeah, and in addition, you know, Fred Astaire and Jimmy Cagney had a lot of similarities as artists, both self-effacing, both unaware of their greatness and their artistry. And whereas Astaire really never lived in the past, never wanted to dissect his films, never really gave it much of a second thought after they were in the can, similar to Cagney. I mean, Cagney was interested in raising Morgan horses, which he did on his farm in upstate New York. Fred Astaire was very much into horse racing and had some successful horses at Hollywood Park. He liked to talk, Cagney liked to talk, as Tom said, about the musicals, but it became pretty well known that it became later in his career, he never even saw the completed prints of his films later in his career, let alone watch them if they appeared on the Late Show. And the only reason Jim Cagney was in Los Angeles is he was married over 60 years to a farm girl that he met in New York named Frances or Billy. And they had a place in Martha's Vineyard. They had a place in upstate New York. And being a Midwesterner, the one thing that Billy insisted that during the coldest winter months that they trek back to their Beverly Hills home and spend the winter months in Beverly Hills. And he would not fly. He and his assistant and his wife would drive all over the country, wherever they went, in a early 60s Bentley. And he would not fly. And in fact, when we were taken back to our hotel, we were driven back by his assistant. We were driven back in that very same Bentley, which was quite a thrill ride for two guys who were, used to driving at home with a 66 Chevy Impala.
And one little add-on to that, just to sort of bring kind of us full circle with, how Hollywood was a real company town back then. RJ was a good friend, obviously, of Cagney, but he had worked his horses, and had been sort of a trainer or an exerciser for Cagney's horses growing up. So that's how he knew Jimmy Cagney. So it's just sort of this, it was kind of way back, way before Dave and I started interviews in 78. It was really a small sort of company factory town where everybody knew each other. And that included RJ, the young generation to these great old stars.
And when RJ later was in the film What Price Glory, directed by the great John Ford, Cagney was in that. And John Ford was infamous for picking on people in his cast. Some said he only picked on the people he liked or respected or loved, particularly John Wayne. But he was really on RJ and picking on him. And Cagney sort of said, just cool it, Jack, just cool it a little bit.
Yeah, what a town. David, do you have a favorite interview?
Well, I mean, the transformational interviews were, Kelly and Astaire. The Cagney experience was unforgettable. But, there was some really interesting interviews like Bob Hope. I mentioned that Bob Hope was great at PR. He would always get on the phone with TV critics to promote his NBC specials. But it was shortly after Reagan was shot, and he talked about the need for gun control. And I don't understand how Reagan's not a proponent of that. And so he was actually giving us a little more in-depth, a real look inside Bob Hope than he typically did. But then we went, a late interview that we did not long before he passed away was a comedian that was very prominent in the 60s and 70s Vegas television named Jack Carter. And we got to him when he was in his early 90s, and he wanted us to write his autobiography, but he was totally embittered that when a celebrity or a comic dies, no one knows him, no one calls him for comment. He was just so bitter that he was, as he said, forgotten.
Yeah, that's sad. I remember reading that in your book. It was very sad. What about you, Tom? Do you have a favorite interview?
Well, they're all, it's sort of apples and oranges. All of them had something about them that were great, which is a real testament to the old school stars. But I would say one of the most interesting ones, the only one we ever had to end on our own, was Rod Steiger. We were out in his patio above Malibu, and it was getting so dark we couldn't see him across the patio. He was dressed in this kind of a bathrobe, and he was pulsating like Casper the Ghost. But he was so amazing, really interesting. We would ask him like what it was like to work with Humphrey Bogart and James Dean or Gary Cooper, and he'd say, turn the tape recorder off, and then he'd strike this sort of Zen-like pose where he'd be thinking for about a minute, and then he'd say, turn it back on, and he would just flawlessly give us this wonderful anecdote about all these guys that we mentioned, who he had worked with. And he was just fascinating. He told us that, which was kind of interesting that we didn't know, that he had turned down the role of Patton, in the movie, because he just said, well, I was sort of anti-war at that time. And he said, it's probably one of the biggest mistakes I ever made. But he said, I don't dwell on that too much. And, he had just wonderful, great anecdotes. So he was just a wonderful one too. And that was a long one, not as long as RJ's, but we were up there a couple hours.
Well, I want our viewers to know that we did not need to turn the recorder off when either David or Tom were answering my questions. They were able to come up with their anecdotes immediately. So, touche, Rod Steiger. Now, are there any stars that you wish you could have interviewed but never got the chance to? I would imagine Judy Garland's right up there.
Yeah, I mean, Judy, we lost Judy, before we started this endeavor. We tried for Katharine Hepburn, who was famously reclusive, John Wayne, and someone that Tom and I really, it was our generation, probably yours too, was Johnny Carson, the 30-year host of The Tonight Show, who was pretty reclusive. But we got to know Ed McMahon and interview him at The Tonight Show in his dressing room. And we got to know his producer, Fred DeCordova, very well, and had some interesting times with both of those individuals. But we never could get to Johnny. And we don't want to make it sound like to viewers that, our batting average was 100% or 1,000. Of course not. We would send out, 10 letters with self-addressed envelopes. We'd get most of them replied, but not all of them were affirmative. I remember, and I still have some of the letters, handwritten note from Henry Fonda saying, unfortunately, I won't be in Los Angeles when you're here. I'm going to be in New Hampshire shooting a film, which of course was on Golden Pond. We were scheduled to interview the great director, William Wyler, and he literally passed away when we had it scheduled. So, of course, that never came to fruition. I remember Alan Alda during MASH. We have a handwritten note from him, and he basically said, I admire you for your pluck, but I don't have time to see you. So, yeah, there was some that got away.
And he's still around.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I would say one that personal fave that I would love to have interviewed, but again, a total recluse that we sent queries to a few times was Irving Berlin when he was living in New York. He lived to a great old age, and he was sort of shut down, and even the Fred Astaire picture wasn't going to get us in with him. I think we had gotten some sort of a response that was very nice, but I can't meet you. I just can't do it. One person that passed away very recently that we had the honor of meeting in his New York townhouse was Stephen Sondheim, which we didn't do a huge interview with him, but we had drinks with him in his townhouse, and he was just amazing. I always say there were two geniuses that I'm aware of that we interviewed, that bona fide geniuses, and one was Fred Astaire as far as performing talent, and the other was Stephen Sondheim, just unadulterated, undisputed geniuses, and we were lucky to see both of them. So
the only name I throw out, and it might be controversial, not so much for Tom and I, but from his artistic standpoint, was Woody Allen. And again, for a lot of reasons, he doesn't do much in the way of interviews, but Tom and I would be on the first plane out to New York if we could get to see him.
Yeah, it would have been interesting to see how he would have opened up to you. And I also wish you could have interviewed Bette Davis.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Would have been great. Yeah, I'm telling you, Harvey, there are so many that, we wish we could have interviewed. We tried for most of them. Frank Sinatra, we got real close, but sometimes the timing just wasn't there, or it just, for whatever reason, we couldn't do it. And a couple of them, we just maybe tried a little too late, or if we would have been born maybe about 4 or 5 years earlier, we could have gotten to a lot of these other people. But, like Dave said, we're not batting 1,000, but we have no cause for complaint for the people that we did see. So.
Oh, and when people get this book and they just flip through the table of contents, it's enough to make you faint.
Yeah.
Now, David, you've been interviewing, writing, and speaking about Hollywood's golden age stars for over 40 years, and you're an adjunct professor of film and pop culture at Marquette University in Milwaukee. Tell us a bit about your career.
Well, Tom and I have pursued this love of ours as a vocation. It's a labor of love. Fortunately, I was employed 36 years full-time in the marketing public relations world. And then as I've eased out of that full-time world a couple of years ago, I've been fortunate to transition to book writing with Tom. We continue to collaborate, doing talks about the golden age of Hollywood. And yeah, I've been fortunate to be at Marquette University doing some film history, film and pop culture courses for about 13 years now.
And Tom, you actually moved to Los Angeles and you've been a senior editor at Netflix. And you've written movie reviews and features for many publications. Tell us a bit about your career.
I've been out in LA for about 23 years now, and I've worked for a ton of .coms. One, Netflix, I worked for 2000, 2001. I was employee number 113 up there, which might give you an idea of the prehistory regarding that. Great company, still is. And I've done a ton of entertainment stuff. I lived in New York for about 14 years and worked in the insurance industry to pay bills, but always Dave and I were doing interviews, on the side constantly for the last really 40 plus years.
Well, you weren't just doing that, because in 2000, the two of you published a book entitled The Beatles Forever, a spectacular collection of memories. I have that book. I love it. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired that book?
Of course, the world of print, as we know, has changed dramatically. Both Tom and I were trained in English and journalism at the University of Minnesota. But in the 80s and even into the 90s, the custom publication, there was a lot of custom publication fan magazines that were at newsstands throughout the country. And Tom and I just, for one reason or another, got integrated during that period. And we're able to write books on things like the Spice Girls and the Beatles and Rolling Stones, and probably all told 10 or 15 of these custom newsstand magazines / publications.
Well, I understand you have a new book coming out entitled Come On, Get Happy, The Making of Summer Stock. Now, that was Judy Garland's last movie at MGM. What inspired you to write that book, and when is it coming out?
Well, it should come out next year. That's when we're eyeing for that publication date. It's with the University Press of Mississippi. These making of books have been popular for a long time. And I think that for Dave and I, our first interest was when Eugene Harmits, a former New York Times writer, did the making of The Wizard of Oz back maybe 25, 30 years ago. And they increasingly come out, and we thought, wouldn't it be interesting? We've done a lot of interviews. In fact, a lot of these people that we've interviewed, Carlton Carpenter, Gene Kelly, Harry Warren, Chuck Walters, were in Summer Stock. Wouldn't it be good to just try one of these to see what we could do with it, where we could go with it? And, it's sort of coincided with the pandemic. So a lot of people that we were able to get, including Savion Glover, the great tap dancer, wrote a foreword for it. And Michael Feinstein contributed, all kinds of people that are just wonderful. They were available because of the pandemic via Zoom, kind of like what we're doing now. We really sort of lucked out in a bad era, as far as the pandemic goes. That's horrible. But, these people had nothing to do, and or maybe as little to do as they usually had. So they were able to get access to them. And that's sort of how it generated.
This year is Judy Garland's 100th birthday year. So I hope it comes out this year.
Well, her centennial is in June. You're exactly right. And Tom and I are both Minnesotans. And of course, Judy's from Grand Rapids, Minnesota. And because of the process that an academic press takes, we were just able to, we worked feverishly on it, but we were just able to submit the manuscript recently. And so it is in the pipeline. And as Tom said, we've been told it could be 12 to 14 months. But yeah, in addition to having the people and a former guest of yours, John Fricke, a great contributor to our Summer Stock book, many, many others, Lorna Luft, Judy Garland's daughter, and others, a yeoman's call out too, because the pandemic was convenient to some extent for getting people to talk to us on Zoom. But the challenge was a lot of the research was at archives at USC or the Academy Library or Southern Methodist or University of Wyoming or Smithsonian. And fortunately, we had some wonderful contacts there that were able to navigate through some of the challenges and give us some invaluable information that we were able to put into the book.
I cannot wait for that book to come out, and I am hoping that you'll be willing to come back on the show and promote it when the book is out.
We'd love to.
Absolutely.
Well, gentlemen, it's been such a pleasure meeting you both and having you talk about your wonderful book. That book is an absolute must for every fan of classic Hollywood. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on our show.
Thank you, Harvey.
Thank you, Harvey. It's been a pleasure.
Our guests have been David Fantle and Tom Johnson, authors of Hollywood Heyday, 75 Candid Interviews with Golden Age Legends. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.